Okay, so let's talk about why verbs, are ever to be a subjunctive to begin with. I went over previously of subjunctive forms and how they are formed and what they look like so that you can identify them as subjunctives. But now the question is, why would they be subjunctive and how do you express them? Well, the reason why things are going to be subjunctives is because they're going to be used in a particular way in particular clauses. Remember that a clause is nothing but an expression of a subject and a verb, and there are two main kinds. You have what is known as a subordinate clause or a dependent clause, one that cannot stand on its own, and you have independent clauses. Now, the very last ones that I will talk about are these four, which all have an asterisk by them, and those are the independent uses, the main clause subjunctive uses. Whereas you can see overwhelmingly in Latin, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of dependent or subordinate clauses that require, because of what they imply, a subjunctive verb. Remember that a subjunctive is a verb expression that is giving non-specificity. It is giving possibility, not statement of fact like indicative. Now, the way that you make something subordinate is the same in Latin as what you do in English. If you take a regular clause like he runs and you get a subordinating word, when he runs or since he runs or although he runs, then that word subordinates the clause and it becomes a subordinate clause. And thus you can see all of these uses, they have some of them, the word in and of itself, the ut result clause, the ut purpose clause. That word ut is the subordinating word. You have here the relative clauses in which obviously the relative pronoun itself, qui, quae, quod, cujus, 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 and I can keep going. Those are subordinating words. You have these conditional clauses. If you have a conditional clause, you will have the word if, and that's a subordinating clause. Same thing with do modo, which translates as provided that, or quin, the quin clause of doubt, and so forth and so on. But the first set of uses of the subjunctive that we talk about are the cum clauses, so-called, because they all involve the word cum, and indirect questions. So I have a study guide for those four uses particularly. Let's go and take a look at those. So, first and foremost, they're called cum clauses because they are all clauses that will require the word cum. Now, first and foremost, when we first encountered the word cum in Latin, it, of course, was a preposition meaning with, and that should be always the first thing that you check for when you encounter this word cum. You want to see, is it hanging around with an ablative? Because cum requires its objects, the object of the preposition, to be in the ablative, and so therefore you look to see if it is functioning in that way. If not, then you are most likely dealing with a cum clause. Now, there are four main types of cum clauses. Cum clauses were listed on the subjunctives here as only being three. That's because there is also a type of cum clause that is going to not be a subjunctive use. It is instead going to be an indicative usage. So, this is what you do. First thing you encounter the word cum, you look and see, is there an ablative? If yes, it's a preposition, it's a prepositional phrase with the ablative, and so you know that it is that. I go to the store with my dad. Cum patre is what that would be. But if not, you got to figure out which one it is. And thus, the cum, depending upon what type of clause, is going to be obviously translated in a different way. If it is a cum temporal, you will say when. Cum circumstantial, you will also say when, but there's a slight difference, and I'll explain that in a moment, when you have an indicative when versus a subjunctive when. Remember, indicative, specific, specificity. Subjunctive, non-specificity. And then, of course, cum causal, you will translate it since. Cum adversative or concessive, you translate it although. And each of these then cum clauses are telling you a thing about the main action. Cum temporal tells you the specific time when. Cum circumstantial gives you the general circumstances when. Cum causal gives you the cause, since. And a cum concessive gives you a concession, although. Nevertheless, so, first thing you do once you've eliminated the fact that it is not a preposition is that you then look to see what kind of verb. Is it an indicative verb or a subjunctive verb? How will you know? The answer is, I'll pause. because of the form. And so remember that when we went over subjunctive forms, you have to see, one, in the present tense, what kind of vowel it has, whether it has the subjunctive vowels, we fear a giant liar, or whether it has the indicative vowels that we have seen so many times and so often. You look to see, is it the imperfect subjunctive? An infinitive plus an ending versus a BA for the indicative. Is it a perfect subjunctive with their forms of erim, eris, erit, erimis, eritis, erint, or the passives in which you will not have the helper verb or the verb to be of the indicative, sum es est, sumus estis sunt, but rather sim sis sit, simis sitis sint. Is it a pluperfect verb subjunctive in which it has the perfect infinitive, amawisse, plus mst, mustisenti, or, as you can see, it would be actus esse, and then, of course, mst, mustisenti. Nevertheless, and so, in each of these, once you have determined whether it is an indicative or whether it is a subjunctive, you will then make a determination as to whether it is the cum temporal or one of these three. So let's say it is a subjunctive. If it were indicative, then you would know that we are talking about when something occurs at a specific time, then you would have a cum temporal. But let's say you have a subjunctive, and thus you have these three possibilities. The first and foremost thing that you need to do is that you look to see, is there the word tamen in the other clause to which the subjunctive is dependent. And if there is a tamen, then you know that you have what is called a cum adversative or concessive clause, but most importantly, you don't need to know what it's named or the term. You know that you need to translate the cum although. Then what you will do is that you will translate in the main clause tamen, meaning nevertheless. So let's say that you've now gone through the steps. There's not an ablative, you do have a subjunctive, there is not a tamen. That leaves you with only two possibilities: the cum circumstantial, when, or the cum causal, since. What you have to do at that point is you merely have to look and translate both when for the clause, and then go back and translate it again, since for the clause, and, pardon the pun, see which one makes more sense. If it seems as though that the cum clause is giving the cause or the reason for a main action, and since makes a better translation, then it's obviously going to be that. But if it seems as though it is giving you a circumstance of something occurring, then when would sound better, and it is going to be then that one. So let's look at 3 or 4 specific examples. So each of these, as you can see, have the roughly same structure for the cum clause, and all of them are going to be obviously translated actually in the exact same way, and that's the point here as well. When you have a subjunctive in a cum clause, you don't need to translate the subjunctive any way differently than necessarily an indicative. And so in each of these, if you look, ludebat, imperfect, luderet, imperfect, the difference is that one is indicative, ba, that one is subjunctive because it has the present infinitive plus the ending, and thus it's still imperfect. And luderet, again, imperfect subjunctive, luderet, again, imperfect subjunctive, and you will translate it imperfectly. And so this verb, ludo, ludere, means, of course, to play, and so it was playing, or played. So, here it says, cum, I look to see, not an ablative. I then know that it is a cum clause. I immediately go and look at my verb. I see it's indicative, and thus I know I have a cum temporal. And so it says, when the teacher played, and then it is canestrali pila. Pila we know from the earlier chapter, I think 13-14, means ball. Canestrali means basket, and so therefore, when the teacher played with a basketball, or idiomatically played basketball, winco wincere wiki victus, he won. So, because this is indicative, then that means that I am particularly talking about a specific indicative time when I played. Say, for example, at the, 2019 GJCL convention, when I was playing basketball with Sinister. I think we have all seen the video. Nevertheless, it would, of course, be at that specific time when the teacher played basketball, he won. Even though Sinister, I think we've all seen the footage, stretching out as desperately as he could to try and block the shot that was to no avail. But I digress. Let's not talk about that. We're all familiar with the footage. Nevertheless, because it is indicative, it is going to indicate that at that specific time, when the teacher was playing basketball, he won. Let's look at the second one. I see the coom. It is not an ablative. I then look and see, ooh, it's a subjunctive. So that means it's one of these three. First thing I'm going to look for, the tomen. Because if there is a tomen, I know automatically it is the coom concessive, and I will translate it although. There is not a tomen. So I'm going to go back, and it's either when or since. So it says, when the teacher played basketball, he did not always win. Since the teacher played basketball, he did not always win. I would argue that when sounds better here, W-H-E-N, because this is not the reason why he did not always win. It instead is giving you the general circumstances. We are not talking about that specific time when, on the baseline, I shot the jumper over the desperately outstretched arms of Sinister. Instead, we are talking about just in general, any point in time when the teacher played basketball, he did not always win. And that is the difference between the two of them. When you use the indicative, it is giving you the specific time, temporal, when the main action occurred. So when, he played basketball with Sinister, he won at that specific time. But if it is the non-specific subjunctive, and we have eliminated the other two possibilities, then what we are doing is giving you the non-specific circumstances. So when he played basketball, at any point at convention or in his childhood or whenever it might have been, he did not always win. Now, let's look at the next one. Coom, not an ablative. We go to look at the verb. It is a subjunctive. We do not see a tomen in the main clause, and so we know it's when or since. When the teacher played basketball in the morning, I guess we could assume in the next morning, he was very tired and very sore, very sick. But here I think the sore would be better. He's, of course, getting older. It's odd talking about myself in the third person, but we could also say since the teacher played basketball in the morning, he was very tired and very sore. I would argue that since makes better sense here, because is the reason, the cause why in the morning he was very tired and very sore the fact that he was playing basketball? Yes. Now, you could say in general circumstances, however, I would argue in my younger days when the teacher played basketball in the morning, he was not very tired and very sore, only as now he is getting a little bit, I am getting a little bit up in my age, is it going to be a fact that I am very tired, very sore. Nevertheless, so here I would argue that this is the coom causal, because what is the cause of him being very tired and very sore? The fact that he was playing basketball. He makes bad decisions sometimes. Nevertheless, let's look at the last one. Coom, there is not an ablative there. We go and see the verb is subjunctive. Let's look for the tomen. Bingo. And all of a sudden, we now know that tomen dictates that this coom is translated although, and it is offering a concession of this main action. Although the teacher played basketball, nevertheless, his factio is nominative, factionis, it's third declension, his team, his faction did not win. So even though I tried my best, the fact that I was playing did not cause my team to win, and so this is offering a concession. Nevertheless, his team did not win, although I will concede he was playing basketball. So that is then the, of course, ablative, or not ablative, the coom clause, adversative or concessive. I know because I have a coom, I have a subjunctive, and tomen then in the clause to which this clause is, of course, subordinated. Now, let's move on. There's one more type of clause that I like to teach alongside the cum clauses, and that would be indirect questions. Now, we've already studied about one type of indirect speech, and that, of course, was indirect statement. However, now we have what are called indirect questions, and they, like indirect statement, are merely things, questions in these instances, that are not asked directly, that someone is not asking directly, but rather that is being reported. So let's look at an example in English. It says, why is he angry? That is a great direct question. I know the answer. It's because the students didn't study. But nevertheless, it is the question asked directly. Now what you can do is you can take that direct question in English, or in Latin, obviously, and you can turn it into an indirect question that becomes a subordinate clause that is dependent upon a main clause. It says here, I do know why he is angry. Or in some instances, you could say, I don't know why he is angry. But I'm going to go ahead and go back to do, because I think we all know why Mr. Adams, I am angry. Nevertheless, if I wanted to, I could put a period right there. I do know, period. And that would be able to stand on its own. But here, why he is angry, that obviously cannot. Now, what we do in English to make an indirect, or I should say to make an indirect question from a direct question, is that we change the word order. Look and see, is he angry? That's asking a question. Whereas here it says, he is angry. And that's what happens when we turn the direct question into the indirect question. I don't know, or I don't know why he is angry. If you were to say that on his own, why he is angry, that's not a direct question. That's just bad English. And so we see again that in English, word order matters tremendously. Now, here it is in Latin. Cui iratus est? Why is he angry? And here we went with the question, I don't. So let's go ahead and fix that. There we are. Nescio. I could easily fix it in Latin the same way. Just simply go, scio, I do know, but we'll go with nescio. I do not know cur iratus sit, why he is angry. Note, in Latin, unlike in English, word order, we all know, means nothing in Latin. But here, what we did is we took the indicative est, he is, and put it in the subjunctive, which we remember, sim, sis, sit, sim is sit. Another example I can now give to you. It says, paterne concilium hodie habet. So the question would be, as we are in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic shutdown very often, parents, both mothers and fathers, have meetings that they must attend. And so we ask the question, particularly a daughter asks a question. I am indeed putting in a little bit of my personal experience that I get. Does Dad have a meeting today? It's asking directly. Habet, indicative. And so I can turn it, however, into an indirect question. Here it says, filia semper rogat. If I wanted to, I could put a period right there, and it would say, the daughter always asks. I cannot tell you how many times I get this question. Nevertheless, the daughter always asks, and that then would introduce now the indirect question. Now, in Latin, remember, if it is a yes-no question, very often there's not a question word for that, like we have the word cur. Instead, we just simply add the enclitic. Remember, enclitic is a little particle word that is going to essentially be attached to another word. We saw that earlier, an enclitic meaning and, here on the word aigerimusque. But nevertheless, when it is a yes-no, when you go to the, of course, indirect version of it, that nay turns into the word on, and it means whether. So, the daughter always asks whether Dad has a meeting on this day. Hoc die is another expression of hodie. And so, again, we can see when the question is being asked directly, it's indicative with that indicative vowel as we see E from the second conjugation, habeo habere. There it is. Do you see the E of habet? Habeo habere, indicative, long E. But when we make it indirect, it's now going to turn into the EA of we fear a giant liar. And so it should then be habeat. And that's exactly what we have there. The daughter always asks whether her dad has a meeting on the day. And so therefore, it's going to be exactly the same. in that you go from indicative, direct question to subjunctive, indirect question. So, even though I've gone through this, I'm sure you don't know it quite well yet. However, what's going to happen is that we are going to go through some examples. I'm about to make another recording, and through those examples, hopefully you will get the hang of seeing cum clauses and how to figure them all out, and obviously seeing the subjunctive when it is expressing the action of an indirect question.